Welcome to Bible study. It's Thanksgiving week, and we're looking forward to a service later in the week and a busy weekend with family and friends. Wanted to get this made and out to you guys. Don't know if you'll have time to watch it, and if you don't worry about it. We have a big chunk of material to take in our next unit together, and it may actually take us 2 weeks to get through this. So if you can't make it on Sunday for Bible study, don't despair. We'll have multiple opportunities, I think, to talk about this. Because we're going to look at actually 3 chapters of 1 Samuel, along with a really important psalm today. We're in chapters 27, 28, and 29 of 1 Samuel. The stories of when David is among the Philistines. He's been there once before. If you remember, he initially fled there and feigned madness and was there briefly. We don't know how long. And then goes back into the wilderness. But now, as we read last week, David has again had Saul come out after him. Again, David has sort of miraculously been able to blunt Saul's attack against him. But at the beginning of chapter 27, as we read at the end of last week's lesson, David is despondent. He is despairing of this working anymore. He's wondering, how long can this go on? And we read there, David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than to escape to the land of the Philistines. Saul is eventually going to find me, and Saul will eventually kill me. And so we have a number of things to talk about with this today. In terms of our presumed audience of the exiled people and people today, here David looks probably the most like them, because David is forced to flee into enemy territory. He is now living with a strange, non-Jewish, uncircumcised people. And he is really looking an awful lot like the exiled people. We'll want to see if we can find multiple ways, perhaps, in which David is being forced into compromising and maybe even lying, or at least not being totally honest with his captors, with the people that he is forced to live among, and how he is navigating being a faithful person in a very, very difficult circumstance. And so, as you read through these 3 chapters, as you look at David among the Philistines, start asking yourself some questions about, well, what exactly is David doing? Why is he doing these things? And how is he navigating that difficult question of remaining on the good side of his hosts here, the Philistines, and yet at the same time needing to remain faithful to the Lord and to his God, his worship, and to the one whom he trusts. That's not easy. And David will make a number of difficult and maybe compromising decisions during this time. At times he will not always be honest. And at times he will be suspect. And there is the people, the Philistines, don't trust him. Just as I'm sure the Babylonians would not trust one of these Jewish people. And they would wonder, are you really assimilated or not? Are you really one of us? And in truth, it's a good thought. It's a good fear, because David is not one of them. They're justified in their suspicion of him. We should spend just a little bit, however, talking about the Philistines, and they're such an interesting bunch. The Philistines are part of a wave of people who took to the water of the eastern Mediterranean and sailed about at the end of the what's known as the Bronze Age. And there was this thing that is still today called the Bronze Age collapse of the 11th and 12th century BC. And it remains one of the great mysteries of history, is what was going on. There was all of this movement of people. We don't know why. Was there climactic? Some people suggest a climactic problem, that there was drought or a climate change happening at the time. Some people have suggested that there were population pressures, overpopulation, or perhaps another people group that we have known nothing about were moving around and forcing these other people out. For whatever reason, a whole series of cultures, city-states on the eastern end of the Mediterranean collapse at this time under pressure from a group of people known as the Sea Peoples. The best record we have of this comes from a city in northern Lebanon today, a place called Ugarit. This was discovered in the early part of the 20th century, and we made a discovery of a royal library there. There's a number of documents, many of them are letters, things like that, that were sent and received. These were all put onto clay tablets at the time. And it has given us a lot of insight, but it has raised so many questions about what is going on. The Sea Peoples initially, or at least at one phase, tried to invade Egypt. They were repulsed by the Egyptians. The Egyptians also give us a record of this, of course, showing their pharaoh heroically casting the Sea Peoples back into the sea. And what they do is they kind of bounce off of Egypt and bounce a little bit north along the Mediterranean coast, and they end up in what is today southwestern Israel. You know it today as the Gaza Strip. It is today one of the most densely populated parts of the planet. It is where many of the Palestinians who were dislocated at the founding of Israel fled to, along with the West Bank. And it is today an incredibly convoluted and politically murky part of the world. At the time, it kind of was too, because the Sea Peoples will become what came to be known in our Bible as the Philistines. And there they set up 5 major cities, and Gath, where David is going to be today, is one of those. They have been plaguing the children of Israel for some time. And what we have archaeologically figured out from this is that they appear to have been able to work iron. And that until this point, the Israelites and the Canaanites and the people who lived there were not able to work iron. They were only able to work in bronze. And there's a big difference between iron and bronze. An iron sword is much lighter. It is much more flexible. It is much more durable. It holds an edge much better. A bronze weapon, in order for it not to break, must be thicker and heavier. It is much slower to use. And even then, they have a terrible habit of breaking in the middle of a battle. And so by simply having a better technology, the Philistines, even though they may have been numerically inferior to the Israelites, were able to win crucial victories against the Israelites and other peoples of the time. Really only the Egyptians, with their massive numbers of people, were able to successfully repulse them. And so you have this pocket, this beachhead of Philistines who are in the southwest corner of the land of Israel. This completely displaces, by the way, one of the tribes of Israel. The tribe of Simeon had been down there, and they are displaced, and they end up actually moving all the way to the north and being located in the extreme northern boundary of the peoples, the tribes of Israel at that point. So David, and they have been here now for a couple hundred years. We know that Samson, in the days of the Judges, was dealing with the Philistine peoples. David flees to the Philistines. This is going to be pretty important because what do you know? The first thing David does when he becomes king is he takes an army down deep into the Negev desert south of the historical range of the people of Judah, and he seizes a mountain outcropping down there. And we know from, again, archaeology that there's an iron mine there. And so we're pretty sure that one of the things David is doing while he's here among the Philistines is a little bit of industrial espionage, and he is learning how to work iron. But at the same time, David has to ingratiate himself to these people. He has to make himself somebody who is able to live inside the Philistine culture and community. He has to become friends, but it's always friendship in quotation marks with David and the Philistines, because later, of course, as king, he is going to win multiple victories against these Philistines. He will come back and fight them anew. But the writer of the Deuteronomic history has to really finesse this, because the Philistines were historically the enemies of Israel. They will be the enemies of Israel. By the time of the exile, the Philistines, along with the Israelites and everybody else, has been conquered by the massive Babylonian juggernaut of an empire. And so they're really no longer a threat. But David, spending time among the Philistines, is a very delicate situation for the Deuteronomic history, because they don't want him to become a traitor, because he is the great David. But at the same time, he's there. And so how are they going to portray this and let David retain his integrity? And how will David manage this without betraying his Israeliteness, his faithful follower of the Lord? So David goes to Achish, the son of Maok of Gath. He and his 600 men. So he brings a small army with him. He and his troops, every man and his household, they bring their families. He brings Abigail. He brings Nabal's widow. He brings so David brings his family too. And so when Saul heard that David went, he stopped searching for him. David says to Achish, "If I have found favor in your sight, let a place be given me in one of your country towns, so that I may live there. For why should your servant live in the royal city with you?" Well, David's looking for cover. David's looking for distance, so that David can be David and not too close to the scrutiny of the king, his court, and all of those who are suspicious of him. And so Achish gives him Ziklag. And Ziklag is one of the smaller communities there. And David is stationed there with his men to defend and presumably to be the ruler of, if you will, this little town of Ziklag. Achish has found an ally, somebody who is willing to help him. And here he gives him this little community. And so David is there, it says, for 1 year and 4 months, 16 months total. Now David and his men went up. They made raids on the Geshurites, the Girzites, and the Amalekites. Notice not the Judahites, not the Israelites. For these were the landed settlements from Telam on the way to Shur and on the land to the land of Egypt. David struck the land, leaving neither man nor woman alive. But he takes away the sheep, the oxen, the donkeys, the camels, the clothing, and came back to Achish. And so when Achish comes to him and says, "Well, who have you made a raid against?" David would say, "Well, against the Negev of Judah, against the Negev of the Jeharmeelites, or against the Negev of the Kenites." These are all allies of Judah. These are all people. And so David is saying, "Well, I'm out in this region." He doesn't say exactly who he's attacking. And remember, he hasn't left any survivors. So there's nobody to tell Achish other than David. And so David isn't really playing entirely straight with the king. He is going out on these raids. He's bringing back spoils. He's sharing that undoubtedly with the king. And so he's ingratiating himself to the king. But the king doesn't realize that David isn't attacking exactly the people whom David says he is attacking. David knows this part of the world very well. This is his home territory. And so he's kind of settling old Israelite scores here. But doing it under the guise of doing it on behalf of the Philistines. I mean, this is just politically perfect for David. Because now he gets to settle these scores, but he gets to blame the Philistines. And that works really well for him. So David left neither man nor woman alive to be brought back to Gath, thinking they might tell about us and say David has done so and so. Such was his practice all the time he lived among the Philistines. Achish comes to trust David, thinking he has made himself utterly abhorrent to the people of Israel. He thinks he's going out and attacking the Negev of Judah. He's attacking these villages of Judah. He thinks that this is David, who's been driven out by Saul, settling his personal scores against the Judahites. But really, David is still settling Israelite scores against these prior inhabitants that Joshua had failed to drive out, who were still troubling to the Israelites. And so really, David is kind of completing the job that Joshua never quite got done. In those days, the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, "You know, of course, that you and your men are going out with me into this war, right?" And David goes, "Very well, then you shall know what your servant can do." "Sure, let's go." "I will make you my bodyguard," says Achish. "I really trust you. I think you're the man to do it." Well, that might be a really foolish thing for Achish to do, because he has no idea what David has actually been up to. And in fact, David has not been doing what Achish thinks. And so this could have been a position where David would have had to choose. I mean, if they really came into battle against Israel, would David have turned against Achish? What would have happened? We're going to see how that plays out. We're going to see how that works here in a little bit. But before we get there, and here's where we may not have time on Sunday to talk about all of this, we get this, we switch gears and we could go and follow King Saul for a few more moments. Saul, in contrast to David, is not trusting the Lord. And in fact, what he does is he seeks out a medium, a spiritualist, somebody who is a necromancer, somebody who is communicating with the dead. And he finally finds this witch of Endor, and they go into a sort of seance of sorts, and they call up the spirit of the deceased Samuel. Remember, he died a couple weeks ago in our reading. And Saul is revealed for who he is. He has gone there in disguise. The medium can see through the disguise, and Saul receives very, very troubling news from Samuel. And Saul is literally unmanned by this. He is cast onto the floor by the time it's all done in sort of a fetal position. He falls full length to the ground, filled with fear because of the words of Samuel. There's a lot to think about there. I mean, what happened? What was this? What do we think is going on? How do we hear this story, especially as post-Enlightenment, modern people? That challenges us, and we want to talk a little bit about that. And we may need, like I said, more than one session to actually work through all of that. But before we get there, we just want to look at David, that what happens with David in this war that's going to happen. So the Philistines are all getting together, and here come all of the various captains and lords of the Philistines, and there they see Achish, and wait a minute, that's David. Don't you remember the song? Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his tens of thousands. David had been this implacable and unstoppable foe to the Philistines for years. And now he's going to be the bodyguard of Achish, one of the kings of the Philistines. And there's a whole bunch of people go, Achish, I don't think that's a very good idea. They're probably right. And Achish says, no, he's great. I like him. And they go, no. David ain't going out with us. Finally, they forced Achish's hand, and Achish comes to David and says, you can't go. And David says, why not? I want to go. Well, David doesn't really want to go. He may want to go, but this is going to be better. David is sent back to Ziklag, while the armies of the Philistines go out to meet the armies of Israel. David won't be there. This means David is not in the compromising situation of aiding and abetting the enemy actively in a conflict. God, according to the Deuteronomist, has kept him from doing that. David, faithful to the Lord, even though he is technically living with the enemy, and Saul, who is technically the king of God's people, are contrasted and shown to be utterly different, because David is trusting the Lord. Saul, unable to bring himself to trust the Lord as he once did, is turned now into somebody who seeks after the very mediums and people that he once forbade. We'll finish out the story on Monday. I just want to quickly read for us the psalm that it's connected to this time and place. It is Psalm number 56. If you have time, or if you have your Bible handy, why don't you grab that, and let's just see how David works through this whole system. Be gracious to me, O God, for people trample on me. All day long foes oppress me. My enemies trample on me all day long, for many fight against me. O Most High, when I am afraid, I put my trust in you. In God, whose word I praise, in God I trust, I am not afraid. What can flesh do to me? See how that contrasts with Saul, with King Saul and King David. All day long they seek to injure my cause. All their thoughts are against me for evil. The kings of the Philistines, the lords of the Philistines, who are really saying David is an enemy. They stir up strife, they lurk, they watch my steps as they hope to have my life. So repay them for their crime. In wrath, God, cast down the peoples of God. The peoples of God. You have kept count of my tossings. Put my tears in your bottle. Are they not in your record? God, you've been with me the whole time. You remember how I've been tossing and turning at night, and how I've been cast around from this to that. You caught all my tears in a bottle. Then my enemies will retreat in the day when I call. This I know, that God is for me. Doesn't feel like it right now, but this I know. In God, whose word I praise, and the Lord, whose word I praise, in God I trust. I am not afraid. What can a mere mortal do to me? My vows to you I must perform, O God. I will render thank offerings to you. For you have delivered my soul from death and my feet from falling, so that I may walk before God in the light of life. We hope to see you on Sunday. God bless your Thanksgiving feast, your time with family, and hopefully with your fellow parishioners here at St. Michael's. God bless you. Bye-bye.